I don't think Starfield is a bad game, but I do think it is a poor Bethesda title. If I think of the Elder Scrolls series, their Fallout games, the first thing that comes to mind is the exploration. It is sorely lacking in Starfield, and this isn't anything you haven't heard before. There are a lot of people who played Starfield. They thought it was okay, they sometimes just couldn't put their finger on exactly what was missing, and I really do think it was the exploration. Everything else, the space traversal, space combat, the different characters, the towns, the cities, the settlements, all of that, I don't really care that much if some of that is lacking. But when the exploration isn't there, it kind of kills what really made Bethesda a decent studio to get excited about. You think of Skyrim, it was an absolute juggernaut despite being a sword and sorcery fantasy role-playing game. And there was a time where that was the nerdiest thing ever. It would be totally niche, and yet Skyrim absolutely brought in the masses, at least in the gaming sphere. Everyone was talking about it. And it was because it was different in the way you could approach things your own way, you could make your own fun, and certainly on the exploration front, you could go anywhere. Todd wasn't completely memeing back then, because back in 2011, that sort of game was a pretty big deal, certainly on consoles. Sure, you had MMOs on PC and such where you could go anywhere, but on consoles, not always the case. Being able to climb that mountain was absolutely a big deal. And I'm talking about this today because there's a Bethesda designer. He doesn't work there anymore. So he was working on Starfield until, I believe it was 2021, but he worked on Skyrim, he worked on the earlier Elder Scrolls titles, and he's come out after leaving Bethesda 2 years ago. He's come out to talk about, I wouldn't say what went wrong, he might not see it that way, but it almost is giving away what went wrong and what the issues with Starfield were. Exposing them almost. I didn't expect this for years. Maybe we'd get a book from Todd Howard where it reveals the truth, he pulls back the curtain. But not the case. This ex-designer, he's come out to talk about it, and he's done an interview on a podcast. And essentially, his name is Bruce Nesmith. He's talked about limited exploration on the game, and the first thing that he says here is that there was a lot of discussion about the scope of Starfield. At one point, I said, I bet this game would be a lot better if we restricted ourselves to about 20 solar systems. However, a very legitimate point has been made that once you make one solar system, making 100 of them isn't that much extra work, apparently. Now, this is 100 solar systems, not 100 planets, 100 solar systems. So that is a lot of different places you can go. And this comment really says it all. This is very much Control-C, Control-V, 5+ times and calling it a day. This is the mindset. And I think a lot of people assumed that this was the case, but they weren't 100% sure. They felt like they were maybe joking. Oh, you know, you're procedurally generating, it's all just copy and paste. But it literally is. Apparently, that's what he's saying. The entire game, when you talk about procedural generation, I know it sounds great, and I think from a technical point of view, if you developed a system where you can make endless content, you'd probably be pretty proud of yourself. That's pretty cool to be able to almost create something and not know what you're going to be walking into yourself. If you make a game that's 100% handcrafted, you're the developer, you go in there yourself, you know exactly what it's going to be. It's like listening to your own voice back or something like that. It's all predictable, and you might not be as excited as someone coming into it who doesn't know. It's unknown for them. But procedural generation, you're going in blind to some degree. Sure, no matter what it is, you'll have an idea of the rule sets and things you put in there, but it could be a fresh experience. So I understand why a designer would be excited about it. However, as a player, it is just lazy. Because if I play Starfield and I go to a planet, I see the same boring rule set over and over. I see the same enemies. Sure, they might look different to some degree, but it's pretty much the same enemies, let's be honest, these aliens. And then you have the exact same settlements, the exact same caves. You go into one cave, you remember being there before on another planet. It was almost identical. You go in, there's nothing. You can perhaps mine some pointless resources. Maybe there's a copy and pasted note that you've read before on a dead body. That is about it. And the real rule set is that if you're procedurally generating, you can't actually offer anything of interest to the player because not everyone is going to see the same piece of procedurally generated content exactly. Maybe close, but not exactly. So they can't offer you a unique weapon that's incredible. When you play something like Morrowind or a lot of other older RPGs, you can find a unique item that's incredible, and you know you've worked for that. You've probably had to clear a hard piece of content. I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 is a good example. You kill a really hard boss, and he drops a really cool item. That's not something you're going to get. That's not something you're going to get in procedurally generated games because they can't do it. They can't give you that awesome unique item because they can't guarantee that everyone's going to get there. So they just give you crap instead. And it sounds like it's being exposed a bit. And he continues on and says, you have to know how to create a planet so that people can walk around it. You have to have various objects, shapes, rocks, all of that. You've got to have your ice worlds, crater worlds. You have to have all this variety. Just by making our own solar system, all that variety, you've done 90% of the work for the rest of the systems. So it sounds like what he's really saying is you have essentially one type of planet, exploring them's all the same, but you give them all a different tint, a different coat of paint. You have an ice one, but it's really identical to the fire one. We've just changed the colours up. It kind of feels like that. Again, this is probably a cool life hack from a developer, but as a player, this is boring. I think boring sums up Starfield. As a game, it's okay. Again, I don't think it's the worst game ever. Some good quest lines. Some of the stuff is decent. But Bethesda's bread and butter was not there, and I think it is making people very concerned about The Elder Scrolls 6. It's a game that I think back in 2015, if that game had have released in 2015, I think it would have been even bigger than Fallout 4. Even if it came out when Fallout 76 did, it would have been humongous. But Bethesda, they dropped the ball in a really odd way. I mean, I'm used to companies being extremely greedy. If it was Activision, we'd be up to Elder Scrolls 15 right about now, and there'd be battle passes, there'd be microtransactions, buying skins, but not with Bethesda. So it's just very odd to me that they didn't milk that cow, and yet we're still getting pretty ordinary experiences. It's a bit of a shame that this is the passion project, that a game where they're copy and pasting 5 different times all these solar systems, no soul at all. That's what they've been spending their time on. It's very odd. Brand new IP, supposedly everything Todd ever wanted to make, and just didn't deliver. I can't see what there is to get passionate about unless you're obsessed with procedural generation. And it was really about making some sort of toolkit for themselves, not necessarily the players having a lot of fun. It gets better. So Todd basically pulled the number 100 for the number of solar systems out of thin air. So it was a marketing tool from the start, but it is something they felt like they had to deliver on. So copy and pasting all of those solar systems purely so Todd wasn't a liar. That's what it seems like, because that did not add to the game. If there was 50 solar systems compared to 100, nothing would have been lost. It was pointless. All the major activities happen in these 20 solar systems. So that 20 they started with before they started copying and pasting. The rest is open space. But people love our huge games. They love this open area to explore. So let's give it to them. No. People like the size of Skyrim. They like the size of Fallout 3. Even Fallout 4. I think those worlds were the right size, where you could explore them top to bottom, spend 100 hours on it, but you would do absolutely everything if you chose to do that. 100 hours, probably a fair number. If you did other stuff, Radiant quests, whatever, you could probably exceed that. But 100's a fair number for just doing the in-games content. And I think that's sort of the maximum. People don't really want a 300-hour single-player game because it gets too much and you start getting into absolute quantity over quality territory. And that is what Starfield has done, because if you like a big game to explore like Starfield, you are not going to be getting quality over quantity. You're getting copy and pasted content. That's all it is going to be. So the idea that games have to keep getting bigger, that is nonsense, because we have really hit that point where you don't need to go bigger, you need to refine what you're doing, you need to get systems right. Fallout 4, the world was fine, the problem was the systems, the dialogue. I mean, even Starfield improved somewhat in that department, but they regressed in so many others. Fallout 4, it's fine to take that world, wasn't an issue, the size. If you thought the problem was we need to make it 5 times bigger, you have got it wrong. You need to look at what the issues actually are, look at feedback, take that feedback and address it properly, because whatever you've done here, I don't think anyone, Skyrim, Fallout 4, looked at the procedural generation of those games, which was things like Radiant Quests, and said, we want more of that. That was where the positives were. No, it was in the exploration, the story through environmental storytelling. And as we continue, so it came down to how do we make exploration meaningful? You didn't. You got that flat out wrong. The game, it's one of the worst games in terms of exploration I've ever played. Hands down. The whole Bethesda kind of style, being able to pick up anything, that was lost to me in this game. And I think that's a problem too with Bethesda, where they were making a new IP. They didn't just need to do everything the old games did and just try and worm that into some new design, some new game, because in Fallout, it makes sense that you can pick up everything. In the Elder Scrolls, it kind of makes sense, but in Starfield, it just feels like you're wasting your time to some degree to be picking up absolutely every item. It feels like a pain in the ass, and I don't see the point. Starfield feels at its best when you are just going from quest to quest and you're fast traveling. If you do anything except for that, it is inefficient, it's not fun. And that's the problem. The other games, it was the opposite. Walking, running, jumping, going to your destination rather than just getting out the map marker and fast traveling. Often, the former was the best way to do it, but in Starfield it's not. So no, you did not make exploration meaningful. And again, you only have to succeed on one planet. Once you get the formula right, you have the formula for all the planets. That's the problem though, they never got the formula right. The very first planet you land on, the tutorial-y sort of planet, even that isn't interesting. You go and you beeline straight for the facility, and you do it. If you don't do that, you run into an invisible wall that tells you you've gone too far, and that feels bad. If you go to any of these locations, you realize quite quickly they are not handcrafted like other Bethesda titles were. It feels boring, so I don't know who thinks they got the formula right, because they absolutely did not. Goes on to say, you have to make hard choices, and I think some of the exploration elements didn't do as well as they could have because they decided to make other choices. Probably the first true that I've read. No, they did not get it right. Whatever they did in terms of priorities, it just didn't seem to be working. And we heard when a few designers at Bethesda, there was one, Will something I think was his name, he was a big lead designer. He left, and he mentioned that some people might have been pulling in the wrong direction. He didn't say it directly, but he kind of said a AAA game is best when people are pulling in the same direction. And I think this is sort of backing that up. It sounds similar, where I think some people were focused on exploration, got it completely wrong. Some people were focused on quest design, did okay, I think, in that department. But it didn't come together. It definitely feels like people were focused on different things, and this whole procedural generation, I wouldn't be shocked if not all the staff are on board with it. And finishing here, make no mistake, every studio on the planet knows the choices they are making. They know what players will complain about. Studios know 90% of the bugs that games are released with. They know what they are, and they're just backed up against the wall. The same goes for game functions. I mean, that does sound like coping a little bit, that you've got a buggy-ass game, it's not running well, and supposedly every development studio is in the same boat, and they're aware of it. I don't really think so. I think what really happens is, when you're testing a game, even if you've got a quality control team, you're only going to pick up so much. You get the game in millions of players' hands, suddenly there's going to be more issues. I think that's just a fact. I don't think it matters what the game is. Doesn't matter how much testing you do. There are going to be bugs, but there is a reason that Bethesda games have much more than pretty much the rest of the industry. What I do think is while they're making unique games that you can't get anywhere else, people are fine with it. The issue is that Starfield, if you remove the whole space exploration, going on 100 solar system planets, if you remove that, you've got a really standard, not really overly interesting RPG. It's fun enough, it's decently made if you just follow the main quest, you do the factions, storylines, they're all fine, but they're not special. So if you play that and you've got a million glitches, the whole thing just looks terrible, the character models, I could go on and on, all of that, it is below the rest of the industry. So when you're not making anything unique, people are going to pick up on it, and they're not going to tolerate it anymore. Fallout 76 was the same. You make some boring survival-like game that isn't a single-player RPG, in the vein of a Fallout 4, Fallout 3, people are going to start to pick on you, which they did. So I think it's exposing Bethesda a little bit. I'm seeing the hype for Elder Scrolls 6 decrease. When they're making these sorts of decisions, I can't see how they're going to bring people back. I think they're going to have to do work on Starfield, release an expansion. I paid for it. I did get the early access to try and support this game. Probably made a mistake. I don't think they deserved extra money. But they probably do need to deliver a promised expansion that they've talked about and make that much better. They should stop with the procedural generation. Release one planet that is actually good and it's got great handcrafted content. Until they do it, I can't see Elder Scrolls 6 really going anywhere. At least I'm not hyped. I think a lot of people are not either. Even if it sells incredibly purely to the name, that's not going to last for them. So thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.